Hello, everyone. Today is Good Friday, and oh, wait a minute. I guess I don't need this thing, do I? Since our social distancing is causing us to be able to meet only by virtual um, communication, such as this YouTube presentation. But at any rate, I'll be glad when this is over. I know you will be as well. But I'm thankful that God has given us a means to be able to share together and communicate together. And so I wanted to share some thoughts with you today with reference to Good Friday and why it's called Good Friday. And to answer that question, I think it's appropriate for us to go back to the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. I'm going to be looking at Genesis chapter 50, if you want to take your copy of the scriptures and look at it along with me. But the reason why I'm going back there is because there's a story that is in there that I think illustrates very well this whole point of what Good Friday is about. As you remember, Genesis is a book that is about the emergence of a nation called Israel. It was the nation that God had promised Abraham and Isaac before, and Jacob, who became Israel. That story also is in Genesis, but that was his new name, and the nation was called the nation of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons, and they became the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of Jacob's sons was named Joseph. And if you read the whole story, you find out that Joseph was Jacob's favorite, born of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And that caused a lot of problems and issues in that whole family. And the result of that was that Joseph was eventually sold into slavery. He was taken to Egypt. And it wasn't until years later, when he was able to interpret a couple of dreams that Pharaoh had, that Joseph was released from prison. He was exalted to be the second in command under Pharaoh himself over all the land of Egypt. And the parallel is stunning, isn't it? There's a contrast or a comparison between the character of Joseph, who innocently was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and then raised up to be elevated to be the number two person in charge. And likewise, Jesus was betrayed by his brethren. He was crucified, but after raising from the dead, he came to sit at the right hand of God the Father, where he is now the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So as we talk about Jacob, it's important, and the story is found in Genesis 37 to 50, but the key verses for my topic today is found in Genesis 50, verses 15 to 21, and let me share it with you. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" So they sent a message to Joseph, saying, "Your father charged us before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, Please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin for what they did to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God your father.' And Joseph wept when he spoke to them. And his brothers came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. As for you, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result and to preserve many people alive.'" You see, what an amazing story that is. They were concerned about him exacting revenge and vengeance upon him, and they were pulling the dad card, basically saying, he wanted you to forgive us. But then they throw themselves at his feet, bowing down, which really goes clear back to the first dream that he had, where he saw their sheaves of grain bowing before his sheaf of grain, and they were so incensed about it. And here they find themselves literally bowing down before him in fulfillment of that dream. But what did Joseph say? And I think this is so critical. He says, "Do not be afraid. Am I in God's place? As for you, you meant it for evil, But God meant for good in order to bring about this present result and to preserve many people alive. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Many of us, I think, have wondered why God doesn't step in and stop evil in this world. Even the other day, there was a neighbor lady next to the church. I talked to her for a few minutes, and she said that she heard someone say that this coronavirus was all God's fault, that he was letting innocent people die when he could and should stop it. And then she asked me in kind of a pitiful tone, she said, God didn't do that, did he? And the answer, of course, is no. God didn't cause the virus to let innocent people die. But on the other hand, evil does exist, and it's really a legitimate question to ask why. So one might suppose that the greatest good would be achieved if God never let anything bad ever happen to begin with. If he kept everybody safe and healthy and never died, and no one ever did any wrong or evil to each other, and the earth always produced good weather and good crops, and everybody was happy and content. That's really what utopia would be, wouldn't it? And in fact, that's exactly what God intended for it in the beginning. It's what he wants to bring about in the end of all these days. So what has gone wrong? Well, God didn't prevent evil from happening. He could have, but it would have resulted in one of two outcomes. First, every creature would have no ability to choose to love and obey. Thus, they would just be nothing more than animated machines. Or the other alternative would be to punish and remove every person the moment they sin. So you can imagine you're walking down the street, you commit a sin, and poof, you're gone. What did God do? You see, the greatness of the sovereignty of God is not that he stops things, but that what was meant for evil, God means for good. That's the ultimate of his sovereignty. Let me explain why. God allowed the freedom of our will to exist, the freedom of us as creatures to choose what we want to do. And God chose to endure the consequences of our choices long enough to give us time to come to our senses, to repent, to turn from sin, to turn from God, and be reconciled both to our Creator and to one another as well. Because you see, we mean it for evil. We do selfish, evil things. God means it for good. Now, what good can possibly come out of evil? And the ultimate demonstration is really what happened on that Friday when Jesus was accused and abused, abandoned, and finally crucified. The author of evil, Satan himself, was determined to destroy Jesus Christ. His ultimate goal was to get Jesus to fail, just as he had succeeded in getting the first man, Adam, to fail. Satan thought if he could accomplish that his rule over creation would be complete. And the only thing left that God could do would be to destroy it. It would be an all or nothing proposition. And if the devil can't be God and have everything worship him, then let everything go to hell, including himself and everyone with it. But since the devil failed to get Jesus to sin, he threw every conceivable force at him to get him to break. He threw sorrow and shame at him. He threw the promise of relief at him. He threw toward him the natural affections for his friends and family. He threw insolent torture and mixed with painful onlookers as they wailed over him. He threw injustice and hatred at him. Not one thing was withheld from the experience of Jesus. Even the tormenting cry of those bystanders saying, "Hey, God's forsaken you," and he would no doubt be thinking, "I did everything right. Look at what God has done to leave me to this fate." I mean, everything was there. The devil meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Jesus knew these were all lies and traps that were set, but he never wavered for 1 second. What the devil didn't realize, nor did the religious rulers or the Roman soldiers or Jesus' disciples or even his own mother, was that Jesus knew all of this was coming. When he uttered that familiar phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" it was not a cry of desperation, but a cry of affirmation. If you read Psalm 22, you will see the prophetic word describing every point of this moment in Jesus' life. The pierced hands and feet, the mocking crowds. They were shouting, he saved others. Why doesn't he save you? Well, let's see you save yourself if you're the one that you're claiming to be. And Psalm 22 talks about them casting lots for his clothing. It's all there. The devil was unleashing every conceivable evil, but God meant it for good. So Good Friday, therefore, is God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. All the sin that every one of us have committed must receive a just recompense. God cannot ignore it, lest he fail to be just and holy. Sin had to have its reckoning. Even as Joseph's brother knew that they deserved Joseph's wrath, and more so the wrath of God for what they had done, but they were spared by forgiveness. You see, Joseph carried the evil of his brother's actions because Jesus eventually carried Joseph's evil, his own sin. Joseph knew by faith that God would have the final say, and God did. And God left his throne in glory, assumed the flesh of human mankind, surrendered to the will and to the law of God in every single detail. And although innocent, Jesus received in his body the sins of the whole world, and justice was executed. The world meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Jesus willingly and intentionally laid down his life for us all. He accepted the blows, the insults, the shame, the cost for every murderous thought and deed, for every adulterous thought and deed, for every lie told, every theft committed, for every blasphemous word, for every insult to a parent, for every idolatrous act of worship, for every covetous motive. Jesus bore it all on his body in the cross when he died. We meant it for evil. God meant it for good. Jesus' last words then, which are often the most important words people speak when their last breath is on their lips. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Which, in essence, he's saying, Father, forgive them. They mean it for evil, but you, Father, mean it for good. He said, "Today you will be with me in paradise," speaking to the penitent thief, which gave that thief assurance that sins can be forgiven. What was meant for evil was God meaning for good. "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother," as he cries out to Mary and John, the woman who bore him. And the law required that Jesus, the firstborn, see to the care of his family, and he was making sure, even in the last moments of his death, he was fulfilling the law of God. What was meant for evil, God meant for good. My God, why have you forsaken me?" was his mind recalling the prophetic word through though the people thought he had lost hope. And so many times I've heard sermons about this where they're saying, he said that because God withdrew from him or forsook it. No. Because that whole psalm is about God vindicating him. Jesus was remembering what was meant for evil, God means for good. "I thirst," which prompted the soldiers to lift a sponge with vinegar and myrrh, which the prophets said, "They gave me vinegar and gall to drink." And so, in fulfillment of prophecy, Jesus said, "I thirst." What was meant for evil, God meant for good. It is finished. The word is tetelestai in the Greek, which literally means paid in full. The debt of sin is paid in full. God's wrath is satisfied. Justice is complete. What was meant for evil, God meant for good. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." It's not a sign of lost faith, is it, when he says that? But it's a total confidence in his Father's promises of resurrection, vindication, and ultimate glorification. And that's why we call it Good Friday. All that was meant for evil, God has spun on its head and made good out of it. Consider what Paul wrote in the book of Romans, chapter 8. This passage is very familiar to most believers. But in Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse 18 through 29, he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation is subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but we also ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our redemption, adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved, but hope is not hope if we already see it or we already have it. For he who hopes for what he already has. But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we eagerly wait for it. And in the same way the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we don't know how to pray as we should. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the heart knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good, to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. You know, you can never quote verse 28, for we know God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose, if you don't appreciate the full context of what was said there. God causes all things to work together for good. Not for everyone, but for those who love him and those who are called according to his purpose. And Good Friday makes possible everything, no matter what it was meant for, to be turned into good for our lives. And that's why it's called Good Friday. And I hope that you'll think about that today, and that you'll realize and relish and worship the God who makes all things possible, who is able to take the most wicked evil of the universe, and he can spin it on its head and turn it around to be good for you and me. That's why it's called Good Friday. Because what Jesus suffered on that cross and the agonies he endured, though they were meant for evil, God meant for good. And God proved it by raising him from the dead. Thank you for watching, and I pray that God will bless you today as you consider his will in your life and what he's doing for us through this weekend, through the coronavirus and everything else that's happening. May God bless us immensely with that confidence that he causes all things to work together for good. May God bless you.